Hey, Mike here. The topic of Atlantis has mesmerized people for centuries. Many of them have spent their entire lives searching for it, but they didn't need to. The Bible actually shows us where it is if you know where to look. So I'm actually recording this in a location that is part of the ancient continent of Atlantis, and I'll explain that later. It sank beneath the ocean thousands of years ago, but it rose again after a short period of time. People just were not in a good position to write about that. Let's start with Plato's description as a jumping off point. That's where most people get their knowledge of Atlantis from, and that's usually where their knowledge ends, unless their minds have been warped by some derivative of Edgar Cayce's work. The entire account of Atlantis comes from two accounts written around 360 BC by Plato, who was detailing the account of his great-grandfather, which he had told him, and doing this all from memory, so some of the details may be a bit off or falsely remembered. Some say that these were written down entirely as fictional morality tales, but it's written in a style which suggests it was meant to be a historical document. Besides this, it stated that Sloane even said it was true. This is recorded as, "Listen, Socrates, to a tale which, though strange, is certainly true, having been attested by Solon, who is the wisest of the 7 sages. He was a relative of my dear friend and great-grandfather Dropides, as he himself says in many passages of his poems, and he told the story to Critias, my grandfather, who remembered and repeated them to us." So let's take a look at the setting first. The account claims that 300 years before Plato, so we're talking 660 BC, an Athenian statesman named Solon was speaking to an Egyptian priest, who told him the story originally. Fun fact, the priest told Solon of the Greeks that there is not a young man among you. This points back to the pre-flood lifespans enjoyed by humans. Think of Methuselah being well in the 900s. As an Egyptian priest, this man would likely have had access to records and the ability to read and write, and that could help him take part in diplomatic meeting. All of this checks out so far. Now, the date in question is currently recorded as 9,000 years prior to Solon's meeting with a priest when the account had taken place. But there is a strong likelihood that there is a misunderstanding with the date with how it was translated from ancient Egyptian to Greek. To be fair, I've looked into this, and the ancient Egyptian characters for hundreds look very similar to their counterparts for thousands. So I see how this could be an easy mistake to make, especially if you didn't grow up reading ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. Additionally, these numbers could be written in any order, and the number 1590, for example, could look a lot like the number for 9,000. Fact is, Egypt did not exist 11,680 years ago. It certainly did exist 3,600 years ago, when a related major event took place 4,300 years ago from now, or 15 to 1,600 years before Solon. While the 1590 year theory holds up pretty well, there's also the possibility that it was really meant to be 900 years, and the Egyptians officially heard the accounting when they were regarding something that took place another 700 years prior. It's also possible that passing the story down over 300 years, mostly through memory, some of the dates were confused a little bit. So what was going on in the world around that time? I'll get back to that when we see why Plato says Atlantis was destroyed and sunk into the ocean. First, let's discuss what Plato records in his own writings. There are a few key concepts which will tell you where and when this was. Basically, some so-called gods decided to divide up the world, and we follow the story of one of these called Poseidon. The divine being falls in love with human women named Cleito, who has children with her. They had 5 sets of twin sons, each of which were half divine and half mortal, human. The children became great leaders over various regions. The ancient Greeks would have known these to be demigods, or half-human, half-god creatures, with the place of being the ruler over humans, or a great king. However, the Bible discusses them also in a different light. In fact, if you look into a certain time in history, everyone except for the ancient Hebrews records this as a golden age where there were half God, half human beings on earth. The Hebrews recorded as a time of great oppression. So in the book of Enoch, and to a lesser extent in the book of Genesis, we see fallen angels reject their roles as servants to the one true God and assume their roles as false gods themselves, being worshipped by humans, and even having children with humans. These children are far more intelligent and more brutal than humans. On top of that, they are giants. These are called the Nephilim. Nephilim comes from, it's a plural word. The im is plural, and nephi is to fall. So this means the fallen ones. Poseidon was the Greek name of a fallen angel who produced Nephilim by interbreeding with human women. The Nephilim children go on to rule over humans in many areas of the pre-flood world. Speaking of that flood, what do we see? God creates land and people. People build a great civilization, but it's because we're interested in what humans want and turns against God, who then destroys the world with water. Yes, a populist democracy is bad, and theocracy is the only true way to govern people. The account which Plato shows us is a God creates land and then people, and those people anger God, or their whichever God, and he destroys the continent beneath the waves. In both accounts, a small number of survivors reach a land near Egypt. The book states that they land in the mountains in a region called Ararat, which is modern-day Turkey, and Plato shows them landing near Egypt. Turkey's near that. So this is the same story. It gets actually a little more interesting too. The city of Atlantis is said to have flashed with the light of a magical metal called orichalcum, while the ark was said to have been lit by a type of stone called zoar. Metal and gemstones are different. Not really. Sapphire is a form of aluminum or aluminium. The screen on the device I'm recording this on actually has a screen made of sapphire. As far as lighting, perhaps either a piezoelectric effect or mild radioactivity combined with a phosphorus quality could emit light in a seeming magical way. To think of radiation, but radiating invisible light spectrum. The Critias also mentions an agreement between regions of Atlantis, stating that an attack on one is an attack on all, and they would not attack each other. Basically, ancient NATO. Yes, the regions of Atlantis had a similar structure to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Atlantic. Let that sink in. The main agreement between all of the most powerful countries on Earth references the Atlantic. As in the days of Noah, right? In the book of Genesis, we see the entire world coming together against the Word of God, and immediately after that, languages become confused and people are separated. The building of the tower was not the problem. God does not care about that. In fact, one of the world's largest towers today stands where that tower was. This tower is called the Burj Khalifa. It was the conspiring of humans against the will of God that was the issue here. Plato recounts that there were many kinds of plants growing all over the world, and that there was a special grove of Poseidon, which was not to be violated by humans. Much death came after this land was violated. Think back to Genesis with the Lord's Garden in Eden, which was a holy place. Death did not exist until after humans chose to sin inside the garden. Whether or not they had sinned outside the garden would have been an issue or not, it probably would have. But the key detail here is that they were inside the garden when they chose to sin, and that the account given through Plato states that that garden being defiled was an issue. That could have just been a difference in opinion in the storytellers. Could the Grove of Poseidon been the Garden of Eden? Probably. There are a number of similarities. Let's look at the six-winged horses, which the gods supposedly had pulling chariots, and compare that to the six-winged seraphim, a flying serpent-like creature with six wings also, which accompany the thrones of God, which are an angel with a wheel-like body. This is called an ophanim. So these six-winged horses pulling the chariots of the gods could have been the seraphim and the ophanim. These creatures could have been mistranslated as six-winged horses pulling a chariot. So, if these fallen angels are the false gods worshipped in the pre-flood world, why all the Greek names? Well, that's for the same reason that the settlers of the 13 colonies in the Americas were called Americans in our history books. They were not American, they were British. We were projecting Americanness on them the same way the thousands of year old world was shown to be very Greek by a story told by a Greek man. Truth is, it was a pre-Hebraic culture which was surrounded by an advanced human hybrid culture of Nephilim, carrying out the will of the fallen angels on Earth. You can think of a insane show on History Channel, but instead of aliens, it is fallen angels, if that helps. You can think of the pre-Hebraic culture surrounded by technological advanced creatures being like the Amish of today, a small group that loves God and stays apart from the rest of the world. Many people go and search for Atlantis and go the route of looking for the creatures, cultures who worshipped bulls or sacrificed on altars, as a big deal was made out of this in the story of Atlantis. But the truth is, this is a waste of time, because every ancient culture was doing this. So back to how the world was destroyed in water. Well, 4,300 years ago, something big happened. A great flood, which is recorded in the book of Genesis in the Bible. God tells us in the book of Genesis that the world was full of evil and had to be cleansed. The book of Enoch shows us that the world was full of half human, half divine creatures, which were incredibly evil. And they were altering DNA and sinning against all kinds of creatures. All of this is through a Jewish perspective. Keep in mind that Judaism did not exist in the time of Noah. Neither did the Greek culture. Now, in Plato's works, the Timaeus and Critias, they show us the same story through a Greek lens. Of course, of a time before Greek existed. The events in question do concern the ancestor of the Jews and Greeks alike, when they were coming from the same people. We are all one through the line of Noah, after all. And if you know any racist people, be sure to tell them that we all come from the family of Noah. So, that's the past. Where's Atlantis now? I believe that the sunken continent of Atlantis is what we now call Pangaea. It was the landmass of the Earth united all as one supercontinent. Consider the fact that all the pieces of the world fit together. You probably learned this in elementary school. This was likely damaged when a flood took over, or water came up from the original Euphrates River, now called the Atlantic Ocean. Consider that some of the fallen angels are imprisoned in an unreachable place at the bottom of the Euphrates River, or as we know it now, the Puerto Rico Trench in the Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic Ocean is actually the largest river on the now resurfaced continent of Atlantis, as the Greeks called it. Where I'm writing this, and where you are reading this from, it's all Atlantis. It always was. So that's just something to think about. What we have been looking for as Atlantis is actually an ancient continent of Pangaea, which all the current continents are parts of. And the story of Atlantis is actually pointing back to the story of Noah. That's all I've got. If you enjoyed this, like and subscribe to hear more. And have a blessed day.